Let's start. I think with the online people, everyone is here. Welcome. First, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting will take place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are genuinely grateful to have this opportunity to work on this land. So, as everyone here knows, we are here to mark a very somber occasion. Just under 12 years ago, Russia violated the most sacred of international norms, violated multiple international treaties, including those signed by Putin himself, and invaded Crimea, sparking a war that continues today. And of course, the full-scale invasion began just over a year ago in the dawn of February 24th, 2022, with a simultaneous ground and air invasion that has killed hundreds of thousands, destroyed billions of dollars in infrastructure. And this is very much, I want to emphasize, and I don't think I'm going to get much disagreement in this room, but it's worth emphasizing that this is very much an invasion of conquest. Russia brought with it not just military folks to take over the country, but Russian teachers to basically eradicate the Ukrainian language, and has deported thousands of children from Ukraine. We are also at a critical point in the conflict where we've seen increasing isolation from the West, from Germany, and most especially, I'm sorry to say, the United States. So, first of all, I want to maybe give a minute in silence for all those who have perished in this conflict, so starting now. Okay, so to understand how we got here, I'm very happy to introduce my old friend, Professor Oksana Shevel. Professor Shevel is not only from Ukraine herself, she also has written award-winning books. And I think, for me, what's this is the most important thing, and this is something I've relied on, especially for many years, but especially in the last 2 years, is she has a deep sense of common sense, which I think is sometimes lacking in many in the world today. So I actually think that's her primary, for me at least, attribute that I appreciate the most. She's an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and the director of the International Relations program at Tufts. Her first book was Migration and Refugee Policy and State Building in the Post-Communist World, and she has recently come out with a path-breaking book, very well-timed. She wrote it, she tells me, in about a very short period of time. Nothing like deadlines, like get us moving. Russia and Ukraine: Entangled Histories, Diverging States. So thank you, Oksana. Please give a round of applause for Professor Shevel.
Thank you very much, Lucan, for the generous introduction. Thank you all for coming to this talk today. It's a pleasure and an honor, and I hope to live up to the common sense expectation. But the talk that I'm going to give today is, as Lucan already mentioned, is going to walk you through. I will walk you through the argument that we develop in this book. My co-author, Maria Popova, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University in Montreal, So the book that we wrote is ultimately about the root causes of Russia's war against Ukraine. And we kind of were motivated to write it at the beginning of the invasion, at least in part, because of the prevailing argument at the time that many, especially non-experts on Ukraine, shared, that somehow NATO expansion was really what sort of triggered Russia to invade. And, Ukraine experts, for the most part, did not share this view even then, but, a lot of general public did. So we kind of wanted to tell the story that we think is more factually accurate than this sort of simplistic argument. I'll come to the argument itself towards the end. And the story that we tell in this book is that ultimately we argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion in February 2 years ago, and the beginning of this invasion back in 2014, as Lucan mentioned, is a result of what we called an escalatory cycle between Ukraine's commitment to independence and Russia's commitment to re-imperialize Ukraine or vassalize Ukraine. And we argue that the cycle started back at the time the Soviet Union fell apart. So we trace the story back to 1991. And the dynamic that unfolded is that the more Ukraine was committed to pursuing its sovereign path and strengthening itself as an independent state and nation, the more Russia resented this process and tried to kind of push in various ways to halt it. And that created an escalation that sort of the more Russia pushed, the more Ukraine pulled away. And this cycle unfolded along three dimensions that we discuss in our book: identity, regime type, and secondarily geopolitical orientation. So I will talk about all three of these. So it is essentially this growing domestic divergence between Ukrainian and Russian political systems and domestic politics that ultimately leads to the war and Russia's invasion, much more so consequential than geopolitical wrangling over NATO. So we will come to that as well. So let me start in the story where we pick the story that we pick in our book. It develops back in 1991, and essentially it has been different understanding of what the collapse of Soviet Union was all about that was present already back then among the Ukrainian and Russian political elites. As of course you all know, after the collapse of anti-Gorbachev coup in August 1991, Ukraine adopts Declaration of Independence, and ultimately this Declaration of Independence is validated at the Ukrainian independence referendum in December with this overwhelming result. And then the presidents of the three republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia signed this Belavezha Accord to dissolve the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union dissolves, but what we argue that the understanding of sort of how final this dissolution was quite different among the Ukrainian and Russian elites going back to that time period. First president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, famously called this development the civilized divorce. So as far as Ukrainian political class was concerned, common statehood was over. Yes, there could be cooperation in economic and other spheres, but Ukraine was basically charting its own independent course as an independent nation and state. But this was not how Russian political class, including liberals around Yeltsin administration, for the most part viewed the Soviet Union. Like, yes, they agreed that it was inevitable in the circumstances of a time, but it was not something that they desired, or really not something that they thought was really final. So we have this already, this is Professor Plokhy's book on the last months of the Soviet Union develops this argument with archival evidence in quite some detail, that once Yeltsin realized that with Gorbachev weakened, he could potentially take over sort of the entire Soviet Union. So this kind of power struggle using Russian sovereignty against the Soviet center lost its importance. And if he could, Yeltsin would much have rather, and most liberals around him, had sort of preserved, reformed Soviet Union instead of having the state collapse. But the circumstances were such that the collapse was inevitable. But again, sort of the expectation on the Russian elite, on the part of the Russian elite, that there would be some over time kind of gradual political reintegration. It didn't have to be, Soviet Union, but one way or the other, Russia and Ukraine would be coming closer together politically instead of being drawn apart. But that's not how the Ukrainian political class perceived it. So we have sort of the beginning of this logic of independence and sovereign statehood kicking in Ukraine and then being developed, and this logic of sort of what would, in Putin's term, become full-scale re-imperialization, but this logic of kind of growing political integration being developed in Russia. So let me walk you through a little bit how we make this argument in the book. So we look at both the elite and the popular opinion side, and originally the story of sort of greater statehood and sovereignty and independence in Ukraine is driven by the Ukrainian political class. In the 1990s, the so-called Grand Bargain was formed in Ukraine. Again, the term is not ours. Andrew Wilson had talked about this Grand Bargain in his earlier book some years ago. And essentially, the bargain was between Ukrainian sort of right and center-right political elites. So here we are talking about the dissidents, the Ruch, who were ideologically committed to Ukrainian state sovereignty and ultimately independence. For many years, they suffered repression in the Soviet period for their views. But they were numerically not strong enough to pursue this agenda single-handedly. Unlike in the Baltic countries, where 1990 legislative elections bring this popular France, pro-independence sovereignty France to power, in Ukraine, 1990 elections bring about sort of 25 to 30% of the Rada, the Supreme Soviet, its seats go to this group, Ruch and their supporters, but majority is still taken by the communist elites. But in the communist elite, there was an important split. Part of the communist elite, here we have first President Kravchuk would be one example, second President Kuchma, and many others, even though they were not ideologically necessarily committed or animated by the cause of sovereignty, independence, or preservation of Ukrainian culture, or revival of history, any of these things, they wanted to rule an independent state. And they kind of quite strategically realized that at the circumstances of the time, with Moscow power weakening, with Communist Party power weakening, sort of playing on this sentiment of sovereignty in the Republic was actually a way to stay in power. And they made this kind of informal bargain. It was never formalized, but essentially how then policies developed was that the right, center-right, and the reformed part of the reformed communist elite decided to pursue policies that would strengthen and legitimize independent Ukrainian state. So again, with this logic of nation-state, the notion that independent state serves and represents independent nation, various nation-building policies were being put in place. So some of the examples here include, for example, Ukrainian as the only state language. It was not so much about making people speak Ukrainian, because, you know, up until to this day, and, you know, especially we see kind of a spike in the use of Ukrainian after the full-scale invasion in particular. But for a long period of time, you know, Russian remained widely spoken, so the policy was not even so much about kind of making the practical linguistic practice change, but it was about symbolism of independent Ukrainian state having Ukrainian as a state language. And we have sort of some of the paradoxes, or seeming paradoxes, could be explained this way, like President Kuchma campaigning on the platform of making Russian official second state language and then never delivering on this promise, again, because it was seen about the symbolism that made the state and the nation distinct. The same goes about citizenship, which is another set of policies we analyze in the book, that Ukraine was committed to not have dual citizenship with Russia. Russia have tried all the way through the 1990s to institute either dual citizenship with Ukraine, which again kind of served to blur the boundaries between political nations, Russian and Ukrainian nations, or institute common citizenship for the CIS, this Commonwealth of Independent States, the sort of loose formation that Russia really wanted to make it kind of more of a joint basis for potential joint state, something that Ukrainian elites strongly resisted. And then memory politics was another one, so kind of narrating the history of Ukraine in a way, again, that would be going against this narrative of existential unity of Russian and Ukrainian people, always wanting to be together through history, instead emphasizing historical periods, personalities, and developments, when Ukraine actually was trying to separate itself, achieve greater sovereignty, and how many of these attempts were crushed by the imperial and later Bolshevik state. So again, sort of this, all of these policies that you know, Ukraine pursued on this logic of state building that was embraced by participants in this informal grand bargain were strongly resisted in Russia. So Russia tried from the 1990s through the early 90s to change Ukrainian policies or influence them on language, citizenship, identity politics, not very successfully. So this change was going on. Now in Russia itself, we're not making an argument in the book that Russia is somehow sort of genetically imperialistic. There were also choices and contingencies to be made. So in the 1990s, there were different options or different visions of the Russian nation circulating among intellectual and political class. Russia could have been defined in multiple ways. So again, there is ample research on that. But for a variety of reasons that we go in the book, having to do with Yeltsin's struggle with nationalists and communists, the so-called red-brown coalition in the parliament, having to do with disillusionment among substantial part of the Yeltsin liberal elite with the fall of the Soviet Union. So this notion that Russia would redefine itself as a nation state in its existing borders and become kind of civic nation in the boundaries that it had was not the view that it existed in the 90s, but it didn't really entrench itself in this kind of more imperial vision that Russia is somehow a Russian-speaking nation, Slavic nation, which potentially embraces at least some, if not all, of the former Soviet territory and people, and especially Ukraine, was progressively getting stronger. And of course, under Putin, that would become kind of the main the driver of government policy. So the point here, sort of, for the story we say for the 90s, that this we already see the beginning of this divergence on these elements of identity politics. And Russia doesn't like what's going on in Ukraine, but because of the degree of political pluralism still exists in Russia, these different options are circulating in the intellectual circles. Kind of the state also has different priorities. There is state weakness. There is war in Chechnya. So for a variety of reasons, kind of prevents Russia acting against Ukraine in some aggressive way to basically put a halt to the policy it doesn't like. Now, the story on the public side is also interesting because, of course, it's not sort of what the elites do, but how the public responds. And in Ukraine, there has been gradual but still existing evolution of public preferences. So again, sort of this drive for sovereignty and independence originally is a lead story. Of course, Ukrainian population supports independence declaration in large numbers in December 91. But once economic crisis hits, after Ukraine becomes independent, many people, begin to sort of think that maybe some kind of closer establishing ties with Russia is a way out of economic crisis. So popular opinion is divided. Many of you are probably familiar with this map of kind of orange-blue Ukraine. These are from the 2004 elections with Yushchenko pitting Yushchenko against Yanukovych. And this kind of narrative of deeply divided Ukraine has been very deeply ingrained in media and in some studies. But scholars who study the Ukrainian popular attitude seriously have always noted there has been a lot of variation and kind of gray area and various dynamics, and these borders were not really quite set in stone. And what we're trying to capture here, that there has been a gradual evolution. So these lines here on the map, just by way of illustration, show regions where pro-Western political parties have been winning on the party list vote in subsequent elections. So if we see in 1991, for example, Ukrainian presidential election, Chernovil, who was, Ruch leader, representative of this sort of center-right, only wins in, essentially in Galicia region in Ukraine. By 98, Ruch, the regions where Ruch comes first on the party list, moves further east, then it moves further east still by 2002, where Yushchenko's Our Ukraine party wins. So in other words, what we're saying that there has been a dynamic within Ukrainian population, that sort of association with the state, kind of acceptance of independence, acceptance of the flag, they also support for policies such as, single citizenship and state language very gradually, but was also evolving, kind of catching up with what the elite was doing. Admittedly, very slowly and unevenly, but again, it was not the direction that favored kind of this reintegration that Russia had in mind. So then we come to the critical junction in our story. So in our story, we talk about two critical junctures, the first of them being the Orange Revolution, the second of them being Euro-Maidan of 2014, when potentially this divergence could have been reversed. So in other words, this kind of growing divergence between Russia and Ukraine was not potentially, inevitable. Things could have happened. It's a story is based on contingencies, and there were certain contingencies that things could have turned out differently. So let me say a few words about the time period of the Orange Revolution and in what way it was a critical juncture. Of course, as probably most of you know, in 2004, there was a critical presidential election. President Kuchma's 2 terms ran out, and the election pit Viktor Yushchenko against Viktor Yanukovych. So Yushchenko presents himself as this pro-Western candidate who is supporting kind of greater Ukrainianization agenda, Euro-Atlantic integration, and he's opposed by Yanukovych, who advocates closer ties with Russia, kind of this blurring identity politics between Russia and Ukraine, dual citizenship, 2 languages, all the sort of things that Russia ultimately would like to see. The elections were very close, and then Yushchenko wins after the electoral fraud brings people to the streets. Then there is repeat second round that brings Yushchenko to power. And then divergence really accelerates. So this is the time period when after 2004, this divergence that was gradually growing in the 90s, really kind of we see a substantial jump. So one is divergence in regime type, and regime type is important. I'll be talking more about it in a minute. But during Yushchenko tenure, for all sort of, inability to deal with corruption and a lot of democratic dysfunction, Ukraine still, the competitive political system really takes root. So Ukraine is ranked as fully free by the Freedom House during Yushchenko tenure. There are free elections, no media censorship, freedom of assembly. All of these democratic rights really become entrenched, even though democracy is it remains very dysfunctional. Yushchenko also pushes identity politics, this Ukrainization policy that are much even, kind of accelerate in comparison with what Kuchma and Kravchuk were doing in the 1990s. There is a law, for example, on Holodomor adopted on the famine of 1932-33 as a genocide of the Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian people actually in the law. Yushchenko tries to also kind of re-narrate the history of the Second World War and characterization of the Ukrainian nationalist groups that were clearly negatively characterized in the Soviet Union as fighters for Ukrainian state independence. There is an attempt to establish Ukrainian independent church. And we also see, I'll show an illustrative slide in a moment, that gradually, again, very gradually, not sort of dramatic major shift, but attitudes of the population begins to change. So for example, Holodomor, this notion, the idea that it has been a genocide of the Ukrainian people by the end of Yushchenko tenure is supported by 60% of the population nationwide. So again, we have kind of the shift that Russia doesn't, does not pushing of the direction of greater reintegration. And in Russia, completely sort of different, so divergence accelerates because of what happens in Russia at the time as well. So first of all, Putin interprets 2004 in Ukraine, not as a development caused by Ukrainian domestic political process, which is exactly what it was, but as some sort of Western ploy against Russia. He tries to bulletproof Russia against potential popular disturbance in the country. So all of various authoritarian measures, from creating of the youth groups and other forms of autocratic consolidation take place in Russia. So there is growing divergence in political regimes. And also on identity front, this kind of re-imperialization agenda becomes more dominant. This concept of the Ruski Mir, or Russian world, is introduced at around 2008, 2009, that essentially is an imperial project where Ukraine is defined as part of this Russian world. So to what extent these were inevitable developments? There could be two counterfactuals that we go in the book about sort of why things could have turned out differently. One is actually Yushchenko could have died. So he was poisoned with dioxin, as some of you may remember, during the election campaign. And had he died from dioxin poisoning, which is sort of a miracle that he survived given apparently very high dose of dioxin that he digested, it is quite possible that Yanukovych would have come to power in 2004, that Orange coalition would not have won. There was a very close vote. Tymoshenko was less popular than Yushchenko. She maybe not would have won had he died. And then Yanukovych would have had much longer time period to both consolidate more sort of Russia-like autocratic regime in Ukraine, which he would then try to do when he comes to power in 2010, and also to begin to reverse Ukrainian identity policy, sort of this divergence on identity front, and try to follow Russia lead, interpreting, again, common interest, continuity of fate. Holodomor was a common tragedy, right? Ukrainian nationalists were always the enemy, like these kinds of things that he would try to do during 2010. Now, another counterfactual is what happened if political competition survived in Russia. Again, we think that's important, that if after 1990s an degree of political competition stayed in Russia, we also probably may not have gotten to the situation of a full-scale war that we are now, because for two reasons. So first of all, even if Russian kind of identity remained more imperial, there would have been at the very least differences in opinion of how to re-imperialize Ukraine. So there would have been voices who maybe not would have advocated for full-scale invasion. There have been voices in Russia, for example, calling for something that Chubais called the liberal empire, kind of making Russia a developed, successful economic model that would become a draw for the former Soviet states. Right. And also, there were still anti-imperial voices. Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated, and others who did advocate for Russia to become like a normal democratic nation state, they would have had more say in the overall domestic political process. So kind of both contingencies we argue in the book could have turned this story of divergence, or could have halted it potentially. One is if Yushchenko had died and Yanukovych came to power earlier, and the other one if Russian political competition survived in Russia in the post-Yeltsin period. But that's not what happened. So we see again 2004 important, as we're saying, the critical juncture, given this graph shows variation in the regime types. Again, we can sort of see, without going into the detail, that the lines begin to diverge the Russian-Ukrainian trajectory in 2004, so very important turning point, kind of this entrenchment of democratic, even dysfunctional, but still democratic competition in Ukraine, and really growing authoritarianism in Russia. And as I was already mentioning, just by way of illustration, the evolution of popular opinions within Ukraine on identity issues. So this is the slide on the recognition of Holodomor as the genocide of Ukrainian people. So already by the end of Yushchenko period, we have 60% supporting this view. If you kind of go into more detail, we do it in the book. Like, this evolution really takes place originally in the central Ukraine. So kind of central Ukraine becomes more like Western Ukraine in its attitudes, and it would take later, after 2014, when views in the south and the east would begin to change as well. But again, we have this trajectory kind of moving away from this narrative of existential unity, common identity, and all of these things, right? So, so to go on, you know, the way that the story goes in the book to the next time period that we discuss. Yanukovych presidency as the last chance to potentially end the escalatory cycle. So if we're thinking, so why invasion, the start of the war at the time that it starts, the failure of Yanukovych regime, his collapse following Euro-Maidan is really important, because during his short stay as a president from 2010 to 2013, he did begin to engage in quite, you know, set of policies that were ultimately, had he stayed in power, could have possibly altered this divergence, and essentially Yanukovych could have tried, how successfully we wouldn't know, but could have tried to kind of deliver Ukraine to Russia, for lack of a better word. So make it similar, more similar both on the political dimension as far as regime type and on identity dimension. So essentially, almost immediately after he is elected in a close but free election in 2010, he engages in various forms of autocratic consolidation, anything from, you know, imprisoning his main rival in the 2010 election, Yulia Tymoshenko, to manipulating and bribing and coercing deputies in the parliament to cobble parliamentary majority, then stacking the court, which would rule to annul the constitution under which Yanukovych was elected. So parliamentary constitution with which he got elected, which came in force as a part of a compromise before Yushchenko's election in the Orange Revolution, is reverted back to presidential system, so giving Yanukovych greater power. On foreign and identity policy, he also pursues things that, you know, again, something that Russia was trying to wanted Ukraine to do. There is a new language law that's adopted in 2012 that elevates the status of Russian, essentially making it official language in about half of Ukrainian regions, eliminating incentives to learn Ukrainian. He changes memory politics. Holodomor is now narrated as a common tragedy of the Soviet people, and he sort of abandons other attempts to move Ukrainian history teaching and narration of history in this direction that undermines the narrative of existential unity with Russia. And in Russia itself, there is also growing autocratic consolidation. Putin, of course, returns to power in 2012 after the protests against the elections before are not sufficiently large or strong enough to really kind of constrain him. So there is maybe some possibility. We didn't put it as a separate counterfactual, but one could think about, had these protests succeeded. I mean, given kind of the nature of these protests, we didn't think it was very realistic, but one could say that was perhaps maybe last chance for Russian political regime to become less, to depart from this greater authoritarian trajectory, but that does not happen. And then Putin wants to create this Eurasian Economic Union and force Ukraine into it. And Yanukovych, so Russia starts trade war because Yanukovych, despite otherwise kind of leaning towards Russia in various ways, continues to pursue the idea of association and free trade agreement with the EU. I'm not going to go for the sake of time into the reasons why he did it. We do go out in the book. I'm happy to address it, but it did serve his interests in various ways, and arguably was also quite reasonable electoral strategy given preferences of the EU within Ukraine. But then at the 11th hour, he essentially reneges after receiving a bribe of some 15 billion or some crazy amount like that from Russia. He essentially reneges on this agreement, and that's what spurs Euro-Maidan protests. So again, sort of the counterfactual is, had Yanukovych survived Euro-Maidan, right, had he stayed in power, had he succeeded in crushing Euro-Maidan, and then continued this autocratization and kind of de-imperialization of Ukrainian identity, again, there was another possibility to bridge the divergence. So Euro-Maidan, you all know the story. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but it's important just to note that, again, the The protests that erupt in Ukraine are not about NATO, they are about Ukrainian political and economic integration and cooperation with the European Union. After months of protests, Yanukovych eventually flees the country. And this is when we see the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So the Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, this is when this divergence between Russia and Ukraine accelerates even further. So this escalatory cycle plays itself out at yet another stage. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the key elements of the cycle during this time period. So, of course, after Russia annexes Crimea and then supports and fosters separatist insurgency in the Donbass, the result is that some 12% of the most pro-Russian Ukrainian electorate is no longer able to take part in Ukrainian elections. And that creates kind of twofold dynamics. So first of all, for the first time in post-Soviet Ukrainian history, the parties with political agenda kind of right, center-right, this pro-Western, integration in the EU, the separate identity as opposed to any kind of joint statehood or political formation with Russia, now they can win majority support. So in some sense, it's sort of a paradox because Putin it helps create reality that he tried to avoid because Euro-Maidan had regional base of support, and one could say that had he not intervened in 2014, it is more likely than not that another round of elections would have produced, the post-Euro-Maidan government could have probably discredited itself, would not be able to deliver on promises of anti-corruption and so forth, and some, Russia-friendly politician could have been elected next time, again, given that Ukrainian electorate was quite divided over Euro-Maidan. But of course, once Crimea is annexed and the war starts in Donbass, this twofold dynamic, the most Russia, some 12%, the most pro-Russian electorate no longer votes, and then opinions also begin to change, including now in the south and east of Ukraine, not in the direction that favors pro-Russian orientation. So kind of this twofold change takes place. Ukraine also becoming more integrated economically and trying to integrate politically in the EU. The association agreement that the EU conducts with Ukraine was actually one of the few agreements where there was also political conditionality. It was actually the first association agreement with conditionality that the EU signs, and the literature shows that democratic reforms are increased through conditionality. So this kind of growing, again, divergence, and in Russia we see growing autocratization, in Ukraine we see growing democratization in the same time period. All right? And then, so Putin tries, he doesn't like any of these things, and he tries kind of various ways to influence Ukraine and to try to bring it back into the fold. And one of the key elements of this process were the so-called Minsk peace agreements. So we have a section in our book about the Donbass war, and the main argument that we make there, so that paradoxically, the war in Donbass was actually not about Donbass. It was really, the Minsk peace process was about trying to create these proxy republics and then give them veto power over central decisions, central Ukrainian government, over decisions of the central government. So it was not really about minority rights in these regions or Russian speakers and none of this. It was really a mechanism, and we have evidence for it, that has come out from the so-called Glaziev tapes, that Russia had a pretty concrete plan. So the plan was that basically to capitalize and sponsor and in various ways instrumentalize dissatisfaction with post-Euro-Maidan government in the south and the east of Ukraine. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I do talk fast. I know, Lucan, but I'm trying, okay? But I do want to talk a little bit about this, how Donbass was not about Donbass, right? So the plan, from what we know from the evidence, was that then the protesters would put pressure on the legislatures in the southeast Ukrainian regions to vote together and to vote no confidence in the central Ukrainian government, which would, again, the Russian narrative was that came to power as a result of so-called coup. And then, as a condition of staying in Ukraine, Ukraine would be federalized. So this the federalization project that Russia originally pursues in the spring of 2014, in an ideal manifestation, would have had all of Ukrainian southeast, the so-called Novorossiya, as Putin calls it, would be essentially integrated formally in Ukraine, but with veto power over what central government could and couldn't do. Now, Novorossiya project fails, and really where there is still a possibility to institute it is in the Donbass, and the Minsk peace process really stalls over the so-called special status for these regions. The special status was never clearly defined. the way Ukrainians understood it, it would be something that would come as the last step after elections could be held there, Ukrainian parties could compete, border control could be restored. But Russia really wanted special status first and foremost, and the special status was supposed to be agreed with representatives of these proxy states. So again, it was really a tool to control central Ukrainian government. And it's not surprising, in our analysis, that even Zelensky, who comes to power in 2019 with a promise to bring peace, and Ukrainian society supported peaceful resolution to the war in Donbass. But this special status that would essentially give these regions, Russia-controlled proxy regions, control over what central Ukrainian government could and couldn't do, was not acceptable either to society, again, the polling results show that pretty clearly, or to the Zelensky government. So this Minsk peace process eventually fails. And that's when we have brings us to the invasion, because this notion of trying to bring Ukraine back into this Ruski Mir, to re-imperialize, to have control over what central government of Ukraine could do, really fails for good with the failure of the Minsk peace process. And that's when we have all levers of influence failing in Ukraine, and of course the oligarch holds in power, the shutting down of these pro-Russian channels, charges against Medvedchuk, one of the closest associates, collaborators who ultimately was exchanged to Russia since the invasion. Right? So in a way, the Russian regime feels that they have been losing all these levers of power that they had over Ukraine, levers of influence, and that's when Putin throws the towel and goes for the full-scale invasion. So again, the invasion was not kind of inevitable, meaning that it was still Putin's decision. He didn't have to decide to do this. But this escalatory cycle leads to this conclusion because the divergence have been growing and could not have been breached, and with the failure of the Minsk peace process, which would have ultimately, had it succeeded on Russian terms, through the special status, would have essentially allowed Russia to control central Ukrainian government, that fails. So just to illustrate the changes that have taken place in the Ukrainian society since then, so this chart shows the growth in identification with the Ukrainian state, so this growth of Ukrainian civic identity. Again, we see 2004 is like a bump, then 2014, and then of course the full-scale invasion accelerates all these processes. So this paradox is really, every time I read this data, I was like, wow, like it didn't have to be like this. Putin managed to accomplish something that no Ukrainian nationalist would have hoped to achieve. I mean, this is really quite some achievement, right? We now have, I don't have these slides here, but we have, for example, even on attitudes, the most controversial, maybe historical interpretation, assessment of this interwar Ukrainian nationalist groups. Now majorities, even in the south and east of Ukraine, would say, yes, there were fighters for Ukrainian state independence. I mean, that's something like, no nationalists could have dreamed of, that these would be the sets of attitudes, and we see that. So this linguistic attitude is another illustration here. So we have, for example, shows already starting by the end of Yushchenko period, clearly more and more people say that Ukrainian is their native language. They may not necessarily speak it, but it is, again, the symbolic identification with the nation and by extension with the state. And then after the invasion, the stop bars show that, more people now actually report speaking Ukrainian. So in that sense, linguistic practice follows linguistic attitudes and not the other way around, which is quite interesting also for the point of view of studying language policy. And if any of you is interested in language policy, Volodymyr Kulik is the authority, and he has published a lot of great and very nuanced analysis of this. So let me now say a little bit about foreign policy, because again, this divergence in the geopolitical orientation, what we argue in the book, that yes, it takes place, but it's really happens, first of all, it happens last. So this divergence on regime and identity precedes divergence on foreign policy orientation. And in a way, the difference on the foreign policy only helps, like we really see in these graphs, especially on the support for NATO. It does not become majority view. It becomes 2014, again, here is an important turning point. That's when we see support for NATO beginning to grow. And then 2022, that's when it really skyrockets, right? And again, the support for the EU, also 2014 is a very important turning point. So this, and then again, of course, 2024. So this argument about NATO, I wanted to end with going over it a little bit, and why we ultimately argue it is not very convincing. So the way we look at it, there are essentially two versions of this argument. The first one is that Russia perceived NATO's expansion as a genuine security threat, and that's why it invaded Ukraine. This argument is probably the easiest to refute. It has been unconvincing already before 2022, and I think it's utterly falsified by post-22 events, including Finland and Sweden joining NATO with anything but sort of peepsqueak from Russia. So clearly, Ukraine was nowhere close to joining NATO in 2014. There was no support, not enough support in the Ukrainian society. There was clearly not support among NATO members. So this notion that Ukraine was kind of imminently would join NATO just does not have a leg to stand on. So Russia clearly did not invade Ukraine to avoid NATO on its border. NATO was not going to expand it. And I think we can also say that, does Russia really fear NATO, given that after Finland joined, and, today, of course, Sweden was approved for membership as well, Russia actually pulls troops away from the Finnish border, right? If you're so afraid of NATO, why would you be doing this kinds of thing? And kind of more broadly, scholars who studied sort of what NATO has been doing over these years emphasize that, first of all, Ukraine had quite limited cooperation with NATO in 2014-22. So there was sort of no NATO activity in Ukraine to the extent the cooperation existed was quite modest, but there was actually quite a lot of activity on the NATO eastern flank. And Russia doesn't really do anything much about it. So instead of trying to fortify its eastern flank, kind of prevent, or guard against possible NATO encroachment, it focuses its energy on attacking non-NATO member Ukraine. So that's, so we think the first argument is really quite maybe easy to refute. The second argument is more interesting and has more merit, in as much that Russia indeed didn't want NATO to expand to Ukraine, right, because it considered Ukraine its sphere of influence. But the problem with this argument is that Russia not liking NATO was just one of a few things that Russia didn't like, and not the main thing about Ukraine. So in other words, the grievances that Russia had against Ukraine go much deeper than Ukraine's geopolitical orientation. And also the timing of Russian action against Ukraine do not really match Ukraine-NATO cooperation dynamics. So whenever Russia was attacking Ukraine, that was not when Ukraine-NATO cooperation was at its highest, and we go through this chronology in the book. Right? And again, this notion that, this the main concern, it was not the main concern, it was really quite secondary concern, and concerns about identity and about potential implications for a Russian political system from this Ukrainian social mobilization were much greater. Just to give you some, by way of illustration, for example, back in 2008, when Russian foreign minister is asked what are the main problems in relations between Russia and Ukraine, and that's at the time when Yushchenko begins to pursue membership in NATO, Lavrov does not mention NATO. He mentions identity and language as the most important things. At the same time period, Moscow Mayor Lushkov, who talks about how Russia needs to invade Ukraine, but he literally says, it doesn't matter what they're doing with NATO, that's because what happens with the Russian language in Ukraine. So that's really, the obsession and the main focus is on these other aspects on identity and language, and NATO only secondarily. And when Ukraine begins to cooperate with NATO under President Kravchuk, Russia is not, Kuchma, sorry, Russia is not particularly upset. That's around 2002, because at that time, Russia itself is cooperating with NATO. It's after 9/11. There is sort of this period of, better relations. And Ukraine is, yes, it's also cooperating, but it's moving in lockstep with Russia. So this notion that sort of vassal is moving in lockstep and developing relations that the patron itself is developing was not really perceived as threatening. And it's only when Yushchenko starts doing things without Russian consent, that's when it really becomes much bigger issue, right? So overall, we argue that the change in Ukraine's geopolitical course was itself a result and not a cause of Russian pressure. So again, Kuchma talks about when there was this incident with Tuzla Island back in 2003, that the more you push, the more we look west. He actually says that. So there is this sort of dynamic that this, what we call escalatory cycle, is clearly evident. And decision, again, Russian decision to move against Ukraine does not correspond with Ukrainian NATO cooperation. Euro-Maidan is not about NATO, and it wouldn't be until after Russia invades in 2014 that Ukrainian constitution would be changed to declare membership as NATO as a goal, and so forth. So in other words, I just wanted to, we have the whole chapter on this in the book, but I wanted to address it. Okay, I'm going to end with just a couple of points for the implications for the current moment. So first of all, the story of divergence between Russia and Ukraine that we tell in the book only intensifies after February 2024. So it is certainly now, we can say, in an overdrive. There is, Russia essentially becomes totalitarian dictatorship. I'm not going to go into detail. It's in the news essentially every single day. right? And in Ukraine, even though there is martial law, there is still quite substantial level of, politics is very well alive, and Ukraine, of course, is now, as a candidate for EU membership, is instituting all sorts of reforms, that some of which we also go in the book. So this, and on identity politics, divergence is even more stark. Russia now in full-throated denial, kind of genocidal rhetoric about Ukraine, that it is not a nation, that people need to be re-educated if they think of themselves as Ukrainian, that they're against Russia and all of this. And in Ukraine, not just decommunization that begins after 2014, but now sort of full-scale de-Russification is taking place. So we're now not just talking about removal of Lenin monuments, there is now removal of kind of legacy of Russian imperial and cultural legacy. And that is also has majority support. So this, divergence that we tell in the story continues and accelerates. The second point that I'm putting here, and that has implications for potential ways in which the war could end and potential ways in which peace could be restored in Europe, Russia remains committed to this goal of vassalizing entire of Ukraine. So it is not just as it did after 2014, and one can say going back even earlier, it's not about particular sliver of Ukrainian territory, the Russian-speaking regions, or Crimea, or Donbass, or some sort of these new territories that they annexed according to their constitution. Really, the goal is to control of central Ukrainian government, vassalization of Ukraine, with a puppet government, or through whichever means possible. So that's why I would say that Land for Peace, our book is more about the causes than sort of the outcomes, but I think it has implications for possible outcomes, because this goal of imperialization and vassalization remains, which would make any kind of Land for Peace settlement both unlikely, and it's something that will not end the war, because as long as sovereign Ukraine exists, truly sovereign, even if its borders have shrunk, Russia has not achieved its goal, and Putin says so himself. He needs to see denazification. What is denazification? It's eradication of Ukrainian identity, so that's also important. And final point I wanted to make is implications for the West. We go over in the book that one of the contributing factors to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was perceived kind of weakness of the West, indecisiveness of the West, and the lessons Putin learned from the West accommodating Russia. So even we can go back to the earlier instances of Russian aggression, going to Georgia, going back to Chechnya, certainly 2014. The sanctions are kind of mild, the West is divided, the West is murdered, the debacle in Afghanistan and all of this. So the lesson Putin learns that the West is permissive, so he can do these kinds of things and not much punishment will happen. So, and I think the lesson there is that this engagement with Russia, that's like another thing we push in the book, that it's not really empirically accurate to say that the West have been confronting Russia. If anything, the West has been really accommodating towards Russia from the way NATO expansion originally developed, with kind of how hard East Central European countries had to push to be admitted. There's sort of this notion that they were lured in somehow, like no, there was a lot of concern and deference to Russia. And that didn't really work. So the main lesson here is that, instead of continuing to kind of be deferential and worried about upsetting Russia, really containment would be a better strategy. So this, recommendation would be that the West really should integrate Ukraine and contain Russia. And unfortunately, this is not something that seems to have sunk in into still many Western political leaders, but I'll leave that to the Q&A. Thank you.
So thank you. That was an amazing talk. Thank you very much. Lots of common sense. There's apparently cards have been distributed. Excuse me. I'm glad I see you have them. Write down your questions. And if you are online and not a Russian troll, I strongly encourage you to ask. You can ask a question if you're a Russian troll as well. I just won't ask it, but that's okay. But in the meantime, I wanted to start off with a question of my own, which is, I think you partly answered it in the presentation, but I wanted to push you a little bit more, which is, I've always been struck, basically, why has Russia been so self-defeating with regard to Ukraine and sort of influencing Ukraine? I mean, you think of 1991. Russia starts off with all of the advantages. The president of Ukraine is a member of the apparat, strong ties to the Russian elite. There is, of course, energy dependence. There are lots of soft power, huge numbers of Ukrainians have a positive view of Russian culture. You also have the very common language. Of course, in the 1990s, many people, still today, of course, spoke Russian. Strong opposition to NATO. And also a number of purportedly pro-Russian presidents who come to power. But it seems like whatever Russia does, it just simply pushes, as you show in your book, Ukraine away. So I guess my question is this: is one, was this kind of inevitable, or was there kind of a more subtle way, something that Russia could have done to sort of influence Ukraine if it hadn't been so ham-fisted? And also, related question, why does the Russian political elite have such a bad understanding of Ukraine? I mean, these are people most of whom have been to Ukraine, often have relatives in Ukraine, can presumably read Ukrainian media, but yet they seem to have this cartoonish understanding of Ukrainian politics. I mean, I just give you one example. A good friend of mine in 2004 really thought that Yushchenko was a fascist, right? Which if you read, any Ukrainian newspaper, you'd know is not the case. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Luke. And this is, in a way, I think the story that we have of this kind of the regime divergence and identity divergence is sort of broad umbrella, I think, under which to answer this question. So I would mention a couple of things. So first of all, this notion that Ukraine could be kind of dealt with, quote unquote, in different ways did exist in Russia, right? So not everybody said that, okay, we need to invade, we need to re-imperialize, we can sort of, yes, we want to be some sort of drawing closer together, but we have many levers to accomplish this, right? As you're saying, from media, from the oligarchs, from, Russian kind of leaning pro-Russian electorate, you name it. But the thing is that time was not working on their side, right? And kind of gradually, if you have some control of your political process, but you don't have full control, right? Like you gain something, but you don't have sort of full control. And I think as Russian, authoritarianism kind of consolidated in Russia, and as people like Putin, who for all we know, is really obsessed about history. He lectured Tucker Carlson for 45 minutes about Rurik and the rest of it, right? Like who really see that somehow, like Russia has the right to control this, right? That they become more dominant. Sort of partial control becomes less satisfactory. So I think this is the thing, right? You could have a lot of influence, but do you ultimately have full control? And I think this notion that you need to have full control over time, as Russia both autocratized and imperialized, becomes stronger, right? So I think these two things, kind of Ukraine, still you can influence it, but you don't have full control, right? And are you going to be okay with it? And maybe, more pluralistic political regime, regime where different voices could be heard about, like how are we going to deal with Ukraine, would have been okay with it. But that's not the dynamic that we see. And that's very evident, even Yanukovych, of all the people, right? We talk about him as somebody who could have sort of delivered Ukraine to Russia, and maybe he could have, but he was also upset. He complains about, he literally complains in the fall of 2013 how he's being pushed too much and nobody understands him. So after, I think, they signed the Kharkiv agreements, you would think, right, great thing, right, the Black Sea Fleet extended, they adopt this language law, you accomplished kind of big thing. And instead of saying, okay, that's fine, like we are successful, look what we accomplished, they immediately push him to give the energy infrastructure to Russia, right? So there hasn't been this, like, you want more and more, right? Was that inevitable? No, but I think this combination of greater authoritarianism in Russia and greater kind of imperial identity among the smaller and smaller ruling elite serves to explain that. And your second question, why such misunderstanding? It is really curious. We call it in the book imperial lens, right? So this notion that Ukrainians are somehow these country bumpkins is very deeply ingrained, that they do not really have autonomy and agency in the same way that, Canadians or Americans do. And if they do something we don't like, it has to be either Western meddling or some sort of fake preferences. And Putin himself says that. He was asked at one of the Valdai meetings a couple of years ago, after 2014, what does he make of this change in popular opinion in Ukraine, which was showing after 2014, all these polls showing greater support for NATO, the EU, so forth. And you know what he says? He says two things. One, he says you can't trust the polls, like all polls are basically fake news. And the second thing he says, that people are afraid to show their true pro-Russian preferences, right? So they're really pro-Russian, but they're ruled by this Nazi junta and they're afraid to say it. And you can sort of see, like in the hindsight, that he probably believed it, because when a full-scale invasion takes place, they travel with parade uniforms, right? He says they don't expect the occupation. They were expecting to be greeted as liberators by the suppressed Russian speakers, right, who were suffering under a quote-unquote Nazi junta. So I think this imperial lens, again, among sort of smaller and smaller ruling, elite, and kind of among society more broadly. This is another thing that now is all over social media. Is Russia really? Is it just Putin's war? Is it Russia's war? Kind of does do Russian, even liberal opposition, can it de-imperialize? Right. So I think we'll see these conversations going.
Great. Thank you. So I want to push you on a few more counterfactuals. I'm sure you've thought about many. One of them is mentioned in one of the questions, but also this relates to my own, which is, there was an option in 2014, of course, that the protests never happened, which is, I think, quite possible, and that, as you said,
it's suppressed.
Or suppressed. But there's also the possibility that the agreement in February of 2014 could have held, and there would have been early elections. So you would have had a weakened Yanukovych, but still party of regions there. Tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems like if the party of regions had maintained a presence, an active presence with Yanukovych in eastern Ukraine, the invasion would have been far less likely. Is that right?
Yeah. Well,
So
it's
what about
interesting with this agreement because, first of all, the agreement, if we remember,
So just to remind people, this is now a tiny footnote in history. Can you just remind people about this agreement?
Yeah. So the protesters, and that's kind of how violence starts, because there is this march from the parliament in mid-February, and one of the key demands of the protesters is the return back to the constitution under which Yanukovych is elected, the 2004 constitution, which was parliamentary and not presidential system, that Yanukovych essentially usurped power. This is, I think, a valid argument since he was elected in 2010. And the parliament refuses to put it even on the agenda. And this is actually the start of this large-scale violence in Mariinsky Park and then, moving to the Maidan. So this is actually kind of something now forgotten because the violence is mentioned that it sort of like spontaneously erupts or, the far-right protesters started. But really what triggers it is the refusal of the parliament to even consider this, right? And then, of course, after several days of violence, then this agreement is signed. And this is the core of this agreement, that there's going to be return to this constitution effective immediately. But by that point, dozens of people are shot. And it's almost like here Yanukovych potentially overplays his hand, right? Or I don't know, who knows if he was his own kind of thuggish tendencies, which he did have given his background and so forth, so that was a bad calculus. I think this agreement could have held had it been signed before the large-scale violence. But I think after large-scale violence and his own security forces deserting him and the party collapsing, right? So it's like, so I don't think it's the fact that, what was his name, Parasyuk said we are going to, like, if the security apparatus stayed and if his party didn't collapse in the parliament, right, we would have seen more violence, but I don't think we would have seen, necessarily overthrow of the regime, right? So I think to this agreement now, but if this agreement was put, let's imagine they did agree to it in the, several days prior and the agreement held, I think Yanukovych would have, yes, it wouldn't, in a way, I think invasion would have been less likely, because I think Yanukovych was in a pretty good position to continue to rule more or less how he ruled. Because I don't know, again, if people remember this, at the time, the most popular opposition candidate was actually Klitschko, right? But they passed a law, which nobody talks about now, that made it impossible to run for presidential office if you haven't lived X number of months or years in Ukraine before that, and Klitschko didn't, because he was somewhere on his boxing adventure or something. So he actually, and the law was specifically written to disqualify him, right? So in that sense, this notion that, if Yanukovych agreed to early elections, he would have lost, I don't think so, because the only credible candidate they had at the time was Klitschko, and he would have been ineligible to run. So that's kind of directly from a playbook of Putin, who has disqualified credible candidates from running in the election for quite some time. So again, the long sort of short of it is that, yes, had Yanukovych managed to stay in power with this agreement, right? And so first of all, if the agreement held, Yanukovych probably would have stayed in power and would have falsified, these elections, and they were already putting people in jail and all the courts were staffed, so the idea that there would be some sort of, it would be basically electoral fraud and nothing to do about it. And yes, the invasion would have been less likely because essentially that's how counterfactual Yanukovych stays on, right? How specifically he stays on could have been because Maidan never happened, could have been because this agreement held, right, could have been, but then this divergence would have been more bridged, right? So he would be making Ukraine more authoritarian and he would be also kind of changing identity politics in the way Russia wanted.
Okay, great. That's not great, but nuclear weapons. So the other counterfactual, there's so many counterfactuals here.
We only have 3, but maybe we should have
I
had
know,
more.
okay. No, but it's just
nuclear weapons, had Ukraine retained its nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there is talk now. I think just, I was glancing at Twitter before we, as we were walking here. I think Radek Sikorski is now saying Poland should develop nuclear weapons because you can't trust, U.S. protection. So in a way, if a country has nuclear weapons, that's supposed to be a deterrent from attack. Now, how realistic was it for Ukraine to retain nuclear weapons in the early 90s? That was the whole other story, given that the economic crisis, that it needed Western aid, that U.S. was completely against it, right, and Western powers. So in other words, would Ukraine be able to withstand the pressure from the West, given, how majorly reliant it was, with the economy collapsing on Western subsidies, right? Would it have become kind of international pariah then? And maybe it would have been kind of easier for Russia to potentially, right, pick up the pieces. Imagine, total economic collapse, dissatisfaction in the, regions, you name it. So in some sense, yes, having nuclear weapons would have probably been a deterrent, and there is now talk that Ukraine should develop nuclear weapons if it's not admitted into NATO. But was it realistic for Ukraine to retain the nuclear weapons that it had at the beginning of the 1990s? I am a little bit more skeptical about that. But of course, Mariana.
So what do you think? So there was recently Sikorski. Radek Sikorski was the foreign minister of Poland. I guess suggestion about Poland getting nukes. Do you think that? What's your reaction to that?
But I mean, this is exactly, I think, the problem is this last point. I mean, the West is really making a big mistake, if you ask me, because really, if Russia is allowed to prevail or hold on to this territory, right, and there is no punishment, and there is, if Ukraine falls or if they capture more of it, and in addition to all this, major refugee crisis and so forth, it is going to lead, among other things, to nuclear proliferation, because that's sort of what the countries would learn, right? U.S. cannot be relied on, even among NATO members, if Poland is now talking about it, right? And if you have nuclear weapons, then you can do pretty much whatever you want, because, the main concern about Russia cannot be allowed to lose. Why cannot it lose? Because the big elephant in the room, that then we're going to have a third world war, and because Russia is going to lose nukes, right? Use nukes. So that's, I think, exactly the implication of this, that, and I can say more about, obviously nuclear war is very bad outcome, but I think if we look at the evidence, I think it was more credible fear earlier in this war than it is now, because so many red lines that Putin said, have been crossed. When he started this invasion in his February speech, right, he says literally, you will see consequences you've never seen in history if you stand in our way. And, a lot of countries stood in his way, and we had, them pushed out from territory that they put in their constitution that supposedly extends nuclear umbrella, from the sinking of the Moskva, from all these other things. So I think this notion that they're going to nuke if they lose, I think it's much less credible than it was, the same argument earlier in the conflict. But yes, I think there is a very real chance of greater nuclear proliferation.
But yeah, I agree with you that it's much less likely now, but it does seem to be a very powerful argument.
It is a powerful argument
of escalation, yeah. Which...
Well, just like today, German leader, right, says we can't give long-range weapons because that's going to be...
Yeah, no, it's as if, Russia could escalate anymore.
Yes.
Okay, so... I want to ask you, first of all, the first one question was about, why was Ukraine so successful repeatedly at defeating wannabe autocrats as opposed to Russia? Is there, there are many potential explanations?
Yep. Well, your book speaks to that question, right? And I mean, if you sort of summarize it and, correct me if I'm not doing justice to your argument, I mean, you have argued that this, what you call divided national identity helps, right? Because exactly this divide between kind of more Russia-leaning, more West-leaning, for lack of better words, terminology, whoever was in power had a natural base of opposition, right? So this sort of political competition in a society divided like this created, right, that's essentially your argument. And I think, so that's, I agree, I think that had a lot to do, I buy it. But then again, if there are other arguments that point, and I think these are kind of harder to prove because they go sort of over the long durée, the strengths of civil society, Ukrainian history of having kind of more powerful society, less powerful state, right? People, and there was always this very active minority that would resist any kind of authoritarian consolidation at a great sacrifice to themselves. And now, of course, civil society is even stronger. So I think in a way, the way I look at it, there are kind of two alternative arguments here. One is kind of your institutional maybe argument that there is this kind of built-in kind of structural almost base for opposition, no matter who is in power, and like it doesn't matter whatever history was, like it's not about the Cossack tradition and so forth. And I think the others, it would be kind of going back to the Cossack tradition, to the powerful municipal kind of legacies. So it's more kind of legacies argument, right? That Ukraine is not Russia, as Kuchma famously says. But that, of course, that argument is harder to prove because you can sort of point to these correlations, through history, but do they really cause? Here we're having a political science conversation, right? Like, what is is it correlation? Is it causation? How do you prove historical legacy? But I think broadly speaking, these are the two sets of explanations for why Ukraine, unlike Russia, where there was neither tradition of this sort nor political divide of that sort, was able to sustain political pluralism.
Okay. Another question has to do, and this has been, has to do, in terms of the timing right now because of Navalny's death. I mean, what do you think of, what's your, what is your opinion about the Russian opposition and
We are on record, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I
just
think.
make sure
okay,
all
yes, I'm
boxes
gonna.
are
I know. I'm gonna be diplomatic here. I think. Let me put it this way. There are brave people in Russia who are against Putin, who are friends of Ukraine, but from all we know, this is a very, very small minority. So I would not say that all Russians are inherently imperialistic, because there is clearly, people who have sacrificed, who have supported Ukraine, who have, done it, but they are very small. And that's kind of we don't know if they're 15%, if they're 20%, if they're 25% maybe, but it is clearly a small minority, right? And then, well, I don't know. We sort of get in this problem of looking at the reliability of opinion polls in authoritarian setting, how you read them and all of this. So I would say, I personally don't know how big a percent, but we don't have any evidence that it is sort of large percent, And then this imperial mindset against Ukraine is very strongly held. This is not, Russian opposition may be upset to hear it, but I think Ukrainians have a point when they say that we need to see de-imperialization in Russia, that Russia needs to acknowledge that it has been an imperial power towards, not just Ukraine, but other former Soviet republics. And yes, it's complicated. Imperialism comes in different guises. So, for example, sometimes counter-argument is used, by Putin and others. Or the Soviet state, pursued this nativization policy and created, promoted Ukrainian language and so forth. Yes, it did that, but it also starved millions of people. It also deported millions of people, right? These things, it destroyed Ukrainian state after 1917. So it is kind of, if you have a civilized discussion, or what did you say? What did you call me? The common sense discussion, right? you will get into all of these nuances. It wouldn't be the argument that here is this, 100% imperialism, there was nothing else to it. But I think, among many in the Russian opposition, Navalny supporters, you can see it in social media, you can see it in the polls, there isn't kind of reckoning with the legacy of imperialism in a way that many Ukrainians say should happen before we can have some sort of, say, reconciliation sometime after the war. And I think, I agree, I think that's true.
Okay. So, a couple of questions that I think have been nagging all of us. The first is about the dreaded phrase Ukraine fatigue, which I want to emphasize that I think we actually had a webinar, I think it was with you, noting that it took a very long time for Ukraine fatigue, in quotation marks, to set in. I think, many of us were pleasantly surprised that almost a year and a half after the conflict, there didn't seem to be a real kind of drop in support for Ukraine, but yet, obviously, recently there has been. So, what do we do about it?
We advocate that it's wrong. I can't think of, there are so many arguments that can be made. We made some of them in the book, made some of them in the conversation today, how it is against Western interests. It would be, it's an illusion to think that if you just give Putin a piece of Ukrainian territory, we can sort of go back to where things were in 2022. Like we were going to have potential nuclear proliferation, all sorts of autocratic emboldening, probably renewed war in Ukraine, potentially, broader war in Europe, and they're not going to happen immediately. So I think there is a sort of siren song of quick settlement, right? Let's just settle and then we sort of forget about it. And that's not even to mention of all these horrific human rights violations that go on the occupied territory. So this occupation is not peace. That's kind of a moral argument there as well. So it's, as somebody who believes it very strongly, it's almost like, I can't believe that this is not self-evident to more people, especially some Western decision makers. So I don't know what we do other than keep talking about it, keep making these points, because the facts are there, right? And sometimes analogies, historical analogies, we are sort of in 1940 kind of, right? Like, we had this, Hitler didn't attack us, why attack Hitler, right? This kind of US isolationism streak with Trump and MAGA Republicans. It's not new, right? Has been a version of it before, and if we are to draw lessons from history, that this, war of imperial conquest, this is such a clear case. It's not, I don't want to make analogies with other conflicts, but there are many conflicts which is much more complicated. It's sort of like not clear on which side the good guys are or what the settlement would look like, and it has been going on for like decades, and it's very complicated. Here is a pretty clear-cut case. There were two sovereign countries with internationally recognized borders, and one of them attacked the other country, and we should just go back to their internationally recognized borders, and that's the end of the war. Right, like that's not really some sort of complicated settlement that we need to arrange and debate and what if So yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that deserves
That's
an applause.
Yeah, so I don't have what do I make of it? We keep pushing. That's as scholars, as people who have a voice, and whoever you talk to politicians, tell them that. I don't know.
Okay, so I'm also going to ask you another impossible question, which you're free to speculate. Is sort of, given, if we accept this fatigue, which, by the way, is not generalized among public opinion, it's really among a certain section of the political elite, especially in the United States. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. Still, I believe a majority of the U.S. public still supports aid for Ukraine. But assuming that doesn't go away, how does Ukraine sort of, what happens, assuming the worst, what happens in the next 6 months?
Assuming the worst, a lot of bad things will happen, right? Because I think just if you sort of try to think through what's going to happen. See, if Ukraine doesn't get Western aid, Russia is going to keep destroying towns and villages and going to keep trying to crawl forward, right? They will slowly or potentially maybe even with a breakthrough, if, say, the aid were to dry up. I'm not a military expert. I don't know how strong the defensive lines are, but you can imagine some sort of breakthrough. If large swaths of territory is captured, we are going to have refugee flows. So we know now there are many refugees in the West. Some estimates now, if, say, Russia were to be gaining upper hand, 20 million people, that's, And then, of course, on the occupied territory, we will have genocidal policy. So all of these torture chambers, mass executions, deported children, all of these things that are happening there would be happening on a much larger scale. If you add to it that the regions we're talking about, big sort of central Western Ukraine at this point, right? This is where the nationalists are in much higher concentration. So if you say in the, southeast, people didn't welcome invasion there anyway, but there is some percent of the population that is sort of reconciled to it and, may even like the new reality, what have you. Like there will be fewer and fewer people like this. So the repression is going to be at a much higher scale, kind of the more sort of central West you go. And then, you can imagine divisions within Western alliance because clearly, countries like the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, Poland are not going to like that. So NATO will be weakened. China might draw lessons for Taiwan. You can kind of imagine, so there are going to be very bad things for Ukraine, but there also would be bad things globally. And it's kind of, to me, as somebody who, studies, analyzes policy, it's really mind-boggling that the time frame for many of these policymakers is so short, right? They're like, Trump says we're going to solve it in 24 hours, right? And then we have these other voices say, okay, they just have push Zelensky to sign a peace deal, and then that's it. That's not going to be it. Right, so and if we think of analogies, I think the so-called pacification of western part of the Soviet Union after the Second World War, I think there are some terrible parallels there because the extent again of aggression there, of the murder, of deportation, we are going to see more of this. Russian former President Medvedev just I think 2 days ago talked about deportation to Siberia of people who are not friends to Russia. We are talking about. It's going to be horrendous. So I think there is no way to pretty it up. It's going to be horrendous in Ukraine, and I think it's going to be also very serious negative consequences for Western unity and global security more broadly.
I sadly agree with everything you say. So you haven't really spoken about Zelensky very much in this talk, which is probably
quite rare for a
You had
talk.
Ola Ono here, right? I understand recently about with her book on Zelensky.
Yeah,
You
it's a great
probably
book.
had your
So, I mean,
share of Zelensky. Yeah.
I mean, not to, you know, there's already been a million counterfactuals, but I mean, I remember I was in Moscow during the 2019 election. This was, and for whatever reason, they were quite freely covering the election in Ukraine. And all my friends, many of whom later, by the way, supported Putin's invasion, they're no longer my friends, loved Zelensky. I mean, they just, you know, they ate him up. I mean, he was authentic. You know, he was obviously, as some of you may not, I'm sure know, he was, you know, a very recognized media star in Russia. And so what impact did it have on the war that a kind of, I think, would call, you know, at least in normal times, you know, pre-2014 times, a Russophile? You know, Zelensky was a Russophile, I think. What impact did it have on the war that someone like him, not to mention also of Jewish heritage, was in power as opposed to someone, you know, further west or more kind of with kind of nationalist background? You know, what impact do you think that had?
Yeah, interesting. I honestly didn't quite think about this before, but I was sort of just thinking on the top of my, you know, the top of my head. I would say two things. So I think what really mattered is that he didn't leave. I think that mattered more than whatever heritage he was, right? Because you can imagine how demoralizing it would have been if the government fled, right? So for whatever, and I know some of the, you know, Poroshenko supporters in particular consider him to be too pro-Russian and so forth. But, you know, the fact that he stayed, I think, made a huge difference. This kind of rallying, you know, support both domestically and internationally, so that's kind of one thing. Now, another thing I would mention, I think the very fact that somebody like him won the election is very telling, because he, if you think about it, right, it was not a pro-Russian candidate, because there were pro-Russian candidates in 2019 election. You know, we had, what was his name, Murayev, we had Boyko, right, who combined won, like, what was it, like in the teens. So that goes to show what a fundamental change it was in the Ukrainian society, right? That this kind of perpetual fight between pro-Western and pro-Russian candidate was no more. And again, Putin can take credit for it. It has to do with electoral geography changes, with, you know, attitude changes. So now there are kind of debates about different visions for Ukraine, right? Like, so Poroshenko was more, you know, army language face, kind of more cultural, you know, that was particularly important. And then, you know, here's Zelensky. Again, he didn't change any of these policies. He was just not particularly sort of, that was not what was animating his campaign. But there is now kind of broader acceptance. And I think, you know, again, thinking as a political scientist, I mean, imagining that the war will end one day, hopefully in Ukrainian favor, I think that's actually good changes for Ukraine becoming a normal democracy. Because now, since any kind of pro-Russian agenda is not going to be something animating the election, you can actually begin to see differentiation among political parties on substantive issues, right? Because before, like, you go to the poll, I mean, I know, you know, people in Ukraine, like, they vote. I mean, I voted like this myself when I voted. It's like, I may share, I mean, just, you know, like some sort of leftist things about social, you know, security and greater role of the state in the economy, but I'm not going to vote for these leftist parties because they're pro-Russian, and that was that, right? But now, since, you know, the pro-Russian parties are really so marginal, if you can even imagine, that's not going to be a winning agenda, so the parties would actually have to say something about what are we going to do on the economy, what are we going to do on corruption, on social policy, you know, gender issues, you name it. So it sort of makes Ukraine kind of more normal democracy in that sense. So I think that's a positive, you know, in the way. So I think, you know, the fact that somebody like Zelensky gets elected against, you know, the clearly pro-Russian candidates. I know not everybody agrees with it, including my aunt. She's telling me, in 2019, the regions won. I was like, no, it's not the regions. The regions were the other two who didn't win, but she would disagree. But anyways, if you're listening, aunt, I'm sorry. we had this discussion in the text, and I didn't, you know. Anyways, right? So I think, so that to me is really telling. So he, you know, I think that's what Ole's book, right? That he is kind of embodiment of this change in identity, and he himself, you know, fosters it. So that's what I would say on Zelensky.
So this next question follows on just what you were saying. You know, very soon, you know, if there had not been the full-scale invasion, there would have been a presidential election. At this point so far, you know, Zelensky, for very, I think, justified reasons that you can maybe recount, has, you know, they have chosen not to hold an election. I mean, can you just talk about sort of
that decision and sort of what you think
Yeah.
Ukraine should do right
Yeah, first of all, I don't think it's like, I mean, I think it's kind of a little bit mischaracterization to say it was his decision. That's what the law says, right? If you have
Right.
martial law, you cannot have elections. So it's not that like he's
Right.
saying, okay, I'm not going to have elections because I don't want to. It's right. So the choice is not to have martial law, which obviously country is at war, right? Or if you have martial law, that you don't have elections. So I think elections, I mean, I think that's a normal kind of, it's not an ideal situation because of course democracies hold elections, but keeping in mind that it's not just a country at war. It would be one thing to say like, oh, you know, there are other countries at war that held elections. But it's like part of the country is under occupation. That's quite different, that there is no, you know, part of the country is occupied, but the country is fighting a war somewhere else and they held elections. That's not Ukraine's story. Here we have occupation. All these questions, not, you know, from security, how displaced people are going to vote, who is going to supervise the vote. So I think if Ukraine actually had elections, if anything, it would lessen the legitimacy of whoever gets elected under these impossible conditions, would be sort of like in the gutter to begin with. So I don't have, you know, like, because it will be an argument that it was not a legitimately elected leader, right? Because some people couldn't vote, because some votes couldn't be counted, because there was bombing, you know, all of these things. So in that sense, I think, you know, that's kind of unavoidable, and I don't see the fact that the elections are not held as some sort of democratic backsliding or anything like that. Now, of course, what is going to happen, inevitably, that questions would be raised after, you know, his official term runs out, raised both genuinely and, you know, by trolls, like, is this a legitimate leadership, right? So Russia already, you know, they're already talking about it, and we're going to see more of it, that this is whole, like, illegitimate government narrative. I think many in Ukraine might also feel that, you know, especially those who don't like Zelensky to begin with. Ukraine could think, we were talking with you just before, you know, the talk started, I mean, Ukraine could think of some ways to kind of counter this crisis, potential crisis of legitimacy. Something like, say, a government of national unity might be formed, right? That's not something that Constitution prohibits. So now his party has majority in the parliament, right? It's essentially kind of like one-party government, but opposition could be brought into the government of national unity. Will we see that happen? We don't know. But obviously, so kind of my two main points that first of all, yes, I don't see that's a problem or anti-democratic given the conditions that, you know, we have to not have elections. And yet the questions about legitimacy would inevitably be raised, and I think Ukrainian government should be thinking how to counter those in the conditions that they have. And I think national unity government could be one potential way to go about it.
Okay. So I guess this will be the final question. I'm not sure there are any more. I hope the reception is that. Sorry? Yeah, you should write. Sorry. Now. It's not too late. It's not too late.
When you say any online questions, that's
No, I did before that. In the meantime, I wanted to let's assume, you know, slightly more optimistic assumption that, you know, some form of aid, you know, military aid continues and the like. I mean, even so, sort of how can you imagine the war ending given, you know, the Russian political elite at this point? I mean, do we essentially have to wait for Putin to die, or will even that not be enough?
yeah. Well, I think we will all be glad when he dies. At least I will be. I can be on record for that. Well, first of all, I mean, the decision to invade was his, right? Like, yes, there were kind of the story that we say that there was this growing divergence, kind of failure to control Ukraine, all of this, you know, prelude. But ultimately, the decision was one person's decision in this very authoritarian setting, right? So in that sense, again, I think it is potentially easier to whoever comes after to change that. It doesn't mean that they will, but at least, you know, no other individual as wedded to this war of invasion as Putin is, because that's what, you know, his decision single-handedly was taken, right? Now, would somebody who is a different person, I mean, here we're really speculating, because who would that different person be, right? Especially now with Navalny is dead. Some of the associates, you know, in Putin's inner circle are hardly, you know, Patrushev and others, they hardly seem to be better. But I mean, at least I think there would be potential for change that does not exist as long as he's in power, right? But then I think the question would also be, it goes back to this kind of imperialization, is somebody who replaces him, would they be willing to not just talk about ceasefire, but actually say, okay, we conquered this territory, we're going to give it back? It's hard, I think it is more likely than if Putin stays, right? It's certainly more likely, but I don't think it's a certainty at all, right? What I think with the military aid, at the very least, what would happen, that no more territory would be captured in Ukraine, right? And again, if Ukraine is able to degrade the Russian capabilities, they may be able to advance. I think that's what Ukrainians are hoping. And I think the argument that Russian capabilities can be degraded and the West collectively, much stronger economy and all of this, we are talking about long term, right? We're not talking about a few months. I mean, we're talking about a few years at least. Again, raises the question, is there resolve in the West for this? What if Trump gets elected in the, and then again, sort of the last thing I'll mention, I mean, those of us who, old enough to remember the Soviet Union collapsing, nobody was predicting it, but once it happened, there were no shortage of explanations. So this sort of the studying the authoritarian regimes, there is always this unpredictability because we know so little what's going on there. Now it seems like very secure, right? Prigozhin was killed, Navalny was killed. The regime seems very secure. But something could happen, and sort of house of cards could collapse in ways that we may be able to explain after it happens, but may not be able to predict ahead of time. Yeah. But I think whichever way you look at it, we are like it is going to be, at least in my opinion, a long-term war. I mean, it doesn't seem like there would be a quick solution, but at the very least, right, Ukraine can be able to defend the territory that it holds. Right? And hopefully, again, there are good reasons to think that with advanced Western weapons, it could make progress and reverse the course of the war. And then maybe you have negotiations or some sort of, but from the position of strength, right? And again, depending who sits in the Kremlin at that point, what incentives they have. Yeah. Not very optimistic, right?
No, well, this is the reality.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe the final question, sort of let's, thinking far into the future, assuming that the war ends at some point. I mean, how do you see the possibility for kind of normalization of Russian-Ukrainian relations, or is that sort of?
I can put some emotions in my questions.
Sure, go ahead, just say it.
No, it just, how do you see the future relationship? Because you mentioned in your book, it's going to the cycle, right? So I count myself from 16th century with more than 100 laws against Ukrainian language comes from Moscow, right? We have genocide 1932, 1933. 90 years ago, we have another genocide. So it's a cycle, right? I had the same experience with my old friends and relatives in Russia. 95% supporting the war.
No, because we need it for to record. So yeah.
Supporting the war. So let's say war is over next year, right? And the Putin is, morto, right? So I don't think the society will change the opinion. In 15 years, 20 years, the Russian will think only about revenge. Because I know Ukraine will win, okay? I know that. Because Russia lost already 2 years ago, okay? I don't know how many years it will take. I don't know how many lives it will take. Ukraine will win. I know that. But the Russian will think only about how to hit back. And maybe the next 50, 60, 90 years, it will be another genocide. That's my opinion as a Russian who grew up in Soviet Union, right, who came here from Russian Federation. And but first of all, Russia has to admit all the crimes. It's number one on the government level.
So
yeah, I think we get the gist,
question,
right,
yeah,
of the
so.
question. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, I certainly don't see any possibility for kind of any short-term reconciliation, right, or even like 10, 15, whatever years. But again, if you think about it, kind of with analogy, like let's think Germany after the Second World War, right? There was a period in time, especially after, right after the war ended, that all the countries that Germans occupied and, committed crimes at really hated, Germany very strongly. But then within Germany, dramatic transformation took place, right? So there was a kind of reckoning, collective responsibility, reckoning with the crimes, atoning for them, was it Willy Brandt who kneeled, all of these things. So it seems kind of, if you're saying that's kind of impossible to imagine for Russia, like I would agree with you, like I can't imagine quite that happening. But if something like this happens, sort of again goes back to this de-imperialization, right? If you can imagine somehow that a Russian, leader would come to power who would want to do this, that say, there is a concerted set of policies to this effect, that society, propaganda is very strong. I mean, now they're teaching that Ukrainians are really Russians and whoever disagrees is a Nazi. Different story could be taught, right? And like,
it's not just the Putin, it's not just the propaganda, it's a collective.
yes, I agree. But what I'm saying, that if we think about kind of experience with Germany, right, and the countries around Germany and sort of the countries that were victimized by Germany, that over decades, these things, like the opinions kind of Germany has changed because of what Germany itself was doing. If Russia were to do what Germany did, right, maybe over like longer term, you can begin to see the possibility. I'm not saying that I believe that they will do it, but I'm just saying if they were to do this, then.
Okay.
Well, I agree with you. In that sense, I would agree. But I'm just saying, if it is hypothetically possible, I think it could be possible under these circumstances.
Okay. Anyways, I appreciate your effort to squeeze a teensy bit of optimism out of. And so, anyways, I think we should all thank Oksana for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.